for coming to our Zoom conversation tonight with Scott Turow. And this is Scott's first Zoom appearance sponsored by the Cliff Dwellers, but Scott's been involved in quite a few activities with the Cliff Dwellers under the sponsorship of the Cliff Dwellers, Society of Midland Authors, Chicago Literary Hall of Fame, but this is his first Zoom. And Scott has, I believe it was May, Scott, that you.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, this
Mid-May.
Yeah, in May. The last trial was published and it's doing very well sales-wise and some great reviews. And this is your 11th book on Kindle. Is it 11 or?
I think it's
interrupt for 1 second so we can take care of some housekeeping.
Yes.
I just want to let everyone know, first of all, we are recording this. Secondly, I'm putting everybody on mute at this point, obviously other than Scott and Richard. If you have questions, we're going to have a question and answer period after the conversation. So please type your questions into the chat function and then I'll relay them after they finish the conversation. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Joe. Okay, our Zoom master. So is this so it's the 11th or 12th? I've lost.
I think it's the 12th novel.
The 12th. Okay.
I think.
All right. A dozen. Wow. That's and then there's other books as well. But this book, The Last Trial, is basically the last trial of Sandy Stern, who has been in every of the Kendall County books, right?
Everyone, yeah.
In some, yeah.
Yeah.
And one of the things I've always wondered about Sandy is, so you as a boy, you grew up in West Rogers Park, as I did. You went to Rogers Elementary.
I did.
As I did. Was there somebody in that neighborhood in West Rogers Park, perhaps a lawyer who reminded you of Sandy, or was there anybody in any neighborhood?
Not in West Rogers Park. My parents had a friend. You know, I was extracted against my will from West Rogers Park, where I, as a child, loved living there because, you know, as a kid, you had tremendous independence. It was, you know, it was long before anybody acknowledged that children could be in danger in an urban environment. And, you know, you went where you wanted to, you got on your bike, you got on the CTA, you just go downtown. So my parents pulled me out of this sort of happy coming of age and moved out to Winnetka. And when we got there, they made friends. And one of our neighbors was somebody who, in physical appearance and manner, was a lot like Sandy Stern. He was not a lawyer, but, and he was not Argentinian, he was Cuban. But he had this arresting elegance about him as a person. It was really impressive. You know, you would look at this gentleman and you certainly your breath wouldn't be taken away. But once he started speaking, it was just, he was beguiling.
Okay, and so then you went to New Trier in high school, and I think you had a journalism teacher there that inspired you to write?
Yeah, I mean, I had wanted to be a writer, which was my mom's ambition, and I sort of acquired it, you know, by emulation, and at New Trier, you know, but I was really unhappy when my parents moved to Winnetka, and I remained unhappy for a couple of years. And I remember driving along, why these things remain so clear in memory, I could never explain. But my father was driving, and we were getting off Edens at Willow Road. And my mother said to me, she says, "You always say you want to write. Why don't you go write for the newspaper?" And it's the kind of stuff that, of course, mothers always say to their children and usually gets ignored. But somehow I thought, all right, I'm not, at least I'll give me something to do, because I was bored and isolated. And it was, I'm not sure I ever gave my mother credit for this, but it was a great idea. I suddenly had a circle of friends, something I cared about. And as you point out, I was practicing my chops as a writer. And I took journalism class, which was taught by Dr. Boyd Guest. And Dr. Guest told us that a journalist has to be able to write anywhere. He can't be Proust. He can't need his cork-lined room. And this proved to be one of the most helpful lessons of my life. It's why I was able to start on Presumed Innocent on the morning commuter train. And then after Guest, he was pinch hitting for Bob Boyle, who was just a phenomenal teacher. He was my English teacher senior year, and he was also the advisor on the newspaper. And he was tough. He wanted that newspaper to be written well. I was the editor of the newspaper, surrounded by a lot of talented people. And it was a lot of fun. I mean, it was the race to get the newspaper in bed every Thursday night. Drove it to the printers in Evanston. Was just, was a little bit of Busby Berkeley about, let's get it going.
So your mom she was encouraging you to write. What about your dad, obstetrician, right? Not a gynecologist.
No, he was an obstetrician gynecologist.
Okay.
He would write both ways. So
okay. What did he want you to be?
My dad wanted me. Let me tell a story. When Presumed Innocent came out, it was, of course, a shocking experience to have finally written a book that, not only, a novel that was published, but that was this gigantic success. And in the midst of all of this acclaim, I asked my father, I'd given him a copy of the book. I said, "Dad, by the way, did you read the novel?" He says, "Yeah, I read it." And I said, "So what do you think?" He says, "I still think you could have gone to medical school." So that's the short answer to what he wanted me to be. He wanted me to be a doctor, just like him. And, now that both of my parents are long gone, I say in public, what of course I wouldn't have years ago, which is my dad was a hard guy to be the son of. And I just had no interest in being like him. And, if being a doctor would have made me more like him, no sale. So, I wasn't going to do it. And of course, years later, as my friends became doctors, I have tremendous respect for doctors, for physicians. And, I think it's a truly noble calling, but I wouldn't even give the thought of it 2 cents at the time.
So when you entered Amherst as an undergraduate, did you major in literature, English?
Well, as I was depressed and scattered as an adolescent. So I went to visit Amherst and I fell in love with the look of the place. And I applied early decision and got in. And in the fall, they send you a course catalog and you're supposed to register. And I go paging through the thing. I want to be a writer. And I look through the course catalog, and there are no courses in creative writing. I had neglected to, I want to be a writer. I neglected to look at the curriculum. And I went and talked to different people. I want to be a writer. What am I supposed to do? One professor who ended up being, a dear friend, Leo Marx, great professor and a famous Americanist. He said, well, why don't you drop out and go down to the New York Public Library and just write all day? I thought, no, that doesn't sound like me. But so I started taking English classes and was with a group of other people who wanted to try to write. Henry Bromell, who ultimately, wrote I'll Fly Away and Homeland, and
Yeah.
a guy named David Black, who was also a successful TV and screenwriter. But we all wanted the college to hire a writer in residence. So eventually they did. And the first one they hired was a poet named Tony Connors from Manchester. And I was very hopeful. I went to see him, and he came, I guess, in my junior year, and he strong Manchester accent, and he says, oh, Scott, he says, I don't know nothing about writing novels. He says, but if I wanted to be a novelist, I'd stuff myself with novels. So I took his advice and started stuffing myself with novels. And then in my senior year, Tilly Olson, great writer of fiction, came and was my tutor. I didn't do anything but write that year and talk with Tilly, and she was wonderful. She was great. She had her own view of the American canon, and
Yeah.
she gave me books to read that I'd never heard of, like Life in the Iron Mills by Rebecca Harding, and The Yellow Wallpaper, which was not a staple at that point because there, feminist literature had not really risen to prominence. So working with Tilly was a great experience for me.
And then you went to Stanford and also studied under some outstanding authors as well, writers as well.
One of Tilly's many accomplishments was that the thing that had given her time to write and extracted her from her life as an organizer and housewife in San Francisco was the Stanford Creative Writing Program. She'd been Stanford Creative Writing Fellow, Stegner Fellow. And, I had noticed the same thing about a lot of writers that I admired, whether we were talking about Robert Stone or Larry McMurtry, Ernest Gaines. They'd all been writing fellows at Stanford. So I applied for one of these fellowships, and I got one. So, somewhat to my amazement, but so I went out to Stanford to the writing program, and Wally Stegner was in his last year teaching there. He had founded that program, and I was in the last class he taught. He was both a friend and mentor as the years went on. Dick Scowcroft, who we always referred to as the second wheel on the bicycle, taught me. Actually, I was in the writing seminar for 2 years, and Dick taught the rest of those classes except for Tilly, who came back and taught the spring quarter, my second year there. They were all great, and my classmates were great.
Okay.
They really were. Ray Carver was around, and Alice Hoffman, Richard Price was there at the time, but also just April Smith. There were both writers whose names you may know and writers you've never heard of, and And explaining one from the other is just a lesson, frankly, in fate.
Were you getting any stories published at this time when you were?
Yeah, I was publishing short stories and, in very little magazines.
Okay.
I published 2 stories in the Transatlantic Review while I was still an undergraduate. I was working on, the great hippie novel while I was at Stanford, and didn't come out all that well, mostly because I just couldn't finish it.
Yeah.
I had that very typical experience for writers, that inability to just let go of it. So I kept pounding on it, hoping that I was going to make it better that way. And of course, obsessing on something doesn't tend to work, and at least not for me.
So what motivated you to go to law school, to apply to Harvard?
Well, after I finished my writing fellowship, they had 3 or 4 endowed lectureships at Stanford, which was a way to keep the writing fellows around for a while and support them, those who could teach and wanted to teach, and wouldn't do too much harm to the undergraduates. And I got one of these Jones lectureships and began teaching at Stanford at the ripe old age of 23. And I taught creative writing classes. And, I did that for 2 years. I had a 3-year deal to do that. Began to focus on the question of what would happen next. And I had gotten, albeit from the steerage level on the faculty, a pretty good notion of academic life. I'd been on a search committee for a new professor in creative writing. Ultimately, the late Jean Leroux was hired, but not without an absolute bloodbath in the English department, as these contending factions about what literature ought to be went at each other's throats. And that experience, among others, made me think, I'm not sure this is really a good life for me. So I began to think about, well, what else am I going to do? My ex-wife had a cousin who worked for one of the studios, and it was possible that Paul could have gotten me a studio writing job in those days. The writers were literally under contract to different studios and networks, and they'd go to the lots and churn out scripts every day. It didn't sound great to me. I could have gone into advertising, which sounded even worse. My son-in-law, the husband of my younger daughter, went into advertising and justified everything I'd ever thought, because he was really good at it and really successful, and he just couldn't do it. He's now a 5th grade teacher at Legacy Charter School, doing God's work. But and so when I looked around, I said, well, is there anything I'm actually interested in doing? And the one thing that I'd sort of been gobsmacked by was how interesting the law was. And this was a great shock to me, because I like to say my dad was a prophet in his own time, in the sense that he was a physician who hated lawyers long before it was common for doctors to do that. And he didn't understand how lawyers thought. They were just too rational for him. My dad was a very, emotional, intuitive kind of guy. And, oddly, whenever I look at Donald Trump, I see somebody who in many ways is like my father. And, he just didn't understand how lawyers thought.
No.
and he wouldn't let him in the house. So I had no idea what lawyers really did.
Mhm.
And so when my friends went to law school and became attorneys, I was sort of astonished by how interesting I found the law. And I noticed that most of the friends I made in the Bay Area who were not writers were lawyers.
Mhm.
And I was especially drawn to what the criminal lawyers did, whether they were prosecutors or defense lawyers. And, I made what seemed like a pretty daring decision because I'd been offered really good academic jobs by then. But I decided I would go to law school.
Yeah, and your book, 1L, I really recommend it to everyone because it's just a great look into, a first year law student and just, a wonderful book. So and then it was eight years in the U.S. Attorney's Office. You came back to Chicago.
Yeah, I've had in many ways a charmed life. So I didn't actually propose writing 1L. I sort of wrote a letter, a wool gathering letter to my agent because she'd been trying to sell a hippie novel with no success. And I was sort of apologizing to her, and I sort of pitched out this idea about a book about law school, but it's not clear when you go back to the letter that I was actually suggesting writing it as so much as giving her an idea in case she knew somebody else. But she shared it with an editor, Ned Chase, and Ned wrote a contract on the spot. By the time 1L came out, it did very well as a first book, but I really was interested in the law, and I wasn't interested in going back to that obsessive, anxiety-ridden period in my life when I was writing the hippie novel that I didn't want to let go of. So I just decided, well, I'm gonna do what I said I was gonna do when I went to law school, which was to both practice law and try to write. And
And a distinguished career, both in the public and private sector. And before we talk about the book for a few minutes, I just wanted to say that you got involved towards I guess about 15 when Ryan was still Governor Ryan was still
Yeah.
governor, the abolition of the death penalty, and
Yeah.
talk a little bit how you changed your views and became a big advocate for the abolition of the penalty.
Well, I spent long enough as a prosecutor. There was no federal death penalty while I was an assistant U.S. attorney. So, early in my career, my friend Julian Solicharovsky and I had a murder case, and it was one of these weird cases where it was committed on a federal reservation. It was up at Great Lakes, and the rules are that if it's a state crime, as murder is, committed on a federal reservation, then the state penal law applies, meaning that in theory, this man could have been sentenced to death. And he was crazy. He was absolutely crazy. And he was institutionalized, and I'm pretty sure he's never come out. But so the thought didn't last long, and once our supervisors realized that there was a murder case that 2 first-year lawyers were handling, they took it away from us as well they should have. But that experience made me ask myself throughout the time I was a prosecutor, well, could I really stand up and ask a jury to send another human being to death? And by the time I had done it for 8 years and watched one of my friends try a death penalty case, same kind of circumstance, state law crime, I had come to the point of saying, well, if I was czar of the universe, I don't think I'd have a death penalty, but it's the law of my nation and my community, and it's my duty to uphold my community's values. So I could probably do this. And then, of course, I became a defense lawyer and pretty quickly was doing a lot of pro bono work and represented, both an innocent man who had been sentenced to death, Alex Hernandez, and other people who'd done what they were accused of, but in my mind didn't deserve to die. And those experiences led to me being appointed to Governor Ryan's Commission on Capital Punishment. It was a long meditation for the 2 years that I was on that commission. And what I asked myself was not, the problem is the way we talk about the death penalty is whether it's right or wrong, whether it's moral or immoral. And I realized that was just not the right approach. The question is, does it work? People think that exacting this form of vengeance will have some practical effect. It will act as a deterrent, or it will uphold, our values and our sense of horror at the worst crimes.
Right.
But the fact of the matter is it doesn't do either. It doesn't deter anybody from committing murder, except maybe contract killers who have already made a calculation about, whether the benefit's worth the risk. And most people who commit murder are far too impulsive to have even considered that. And it doesn't deliver this clear moral message because it's applied in such haphazard, slipshod manner. So there's no rhyme or reason to who actually gets the death penalty, except the prison saying that there ain't no rich men on death row. That much is certainly true. And I just realized that this is a total, it's a total misfire as a legal project. We spend all this money, all this emotional energy on something that doesn't work. It doesn't give people what they want. And of course, there's the possibility of error. There's all kinds of things wrong with it. We can't take the issue of race out of the capital system because people get the death penalty far more often for killing white people than for killing Black people. This devaluation of Black lives that's summed up in the term Black Lives Matter, that pervades the capital punishment system, even though Blacks and whites are not put to death at the rates that in the proportions you would think. But it doesn't work. It's not worth having. It's not worth all the storm and drang. It gives nobody what they want. And then it delivers the falsest of all claims to the grieving families that, it's going to set the world right. They're going to be able to feel better about things. And they live with that fantasy, and then the murderer is put to death, and guess what?
Yeah.
They're still dealing with the loss.
Yeah. And in this book, Last Trial, you're looking into the pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah.
Have you had an interest in that over the years?
Well, I started just sort of randomly thinking about healthcare as, probably this is having not taken my father's advice and gone to medical school. And, you look up and it's what, 20% of the national economy now. And maybe it's getting older that made me more conscious of it. But I thought, maybe it would be interesting to write a novel about the healthcare system. And I do have a daughter who's a pharma lawyer. So every now and then I would listen to her talk about work and learn things about it. But really so I started thinking about writing this book and trying to figure out what kind of crime would involve pharmaceuticals. But I wasn't getting a long way in that contemplation until I was thinking about Sandy Stern. And in the novel before this novel, which is called Testimony, Sandy Stern, as has been the case since Presumed Innocent, appears either in the foreground or in the background. But I wrote Sandy into this background scene in Testimony. And, years before in Innocent, I had said that he had serious, life-threatening lung cancer. And I'm looking up, it's now supposed to be 7 or 8 years later in the life of Kendall County. And I'm asking myself, gosh, how did a guy who had metastatic lung cancer, how is he still alive 7 or 8 years later? And I thought to myself, well, there are a lot of really interesting new therapies, and maybe he's had one of them. And that's where the connection began to be made in my mind, that maybe Sandy Stern's cancer had been arrested by the medication whose creator is now on trial, and as Stern's client. And so, that was the basis for the last trial.
And it makes an intriguing story, and I very highly recommend it. Joan, I think we have a few questions, don't we?
No, I don't see any questions.
We don't have any questions. Okay.
Here we go. Catherine's got one. What other authors are you friends with, and how do they help you become a better writer?
That's first of all, to me, writers remain the truest rock stars. So, one of the great privileges of becoming successful has been getting to know other writers. So, most infamously, I am a member of a rock and roll band. I just noticed that I'm sailing under false colors because Adrian's name is attached to mine up on Zoom, but I think people know who I am. This is a rock and roll band that plays cover tunes, not terribly well, but they're all, with the exception of a few ringers who've got to keep us, on beat, and sounding somewhat like the song. Everybody else is a writer, and some of them very, very good musicians. Like Dave Berry, who among Dave's many achievements is he has perfect pitch. And so we have, Dave and Mitch Albom, who at one time made his living as a piano player before he started writing sports, and Greg Iles, who was another professional musician before he returned to college and started writing. Ridley Pearson, who toured for many years with a band called the Five Toast Points. And then there are in the band people like me, who are basically no talent bums. Stephen King is probably, he's more on my side of things than the other side of things. He's a bravura performer. He's just amazing in front of a crowd. He's a great performer, but not record breaking on musical talent. So, but the band has spent years traveling together, and we have wonderful time. People like Mary Carr and Amy Tan are members of the band. James McBride's a band member. I mean, wonderful writers. I just thrilled to be with them. The late Frank McCourt toured with us a couple of seasons. And but Dave will come, crashing to the back of the bus whenever he hears anybody talking about writing. That is not what we're there for. We're not supposed to talk about writing. And every now and then the suspense writers will huddle in the back together, Ridley and Greg and I, and we will talk a little bit about stuff, but it reminds me of, can't remember who the two artists were. Henry Moore was one. I think Henry Moore and Picasso had a meeting, and somebody asked him afterwards, well, what did you talk about? And Moore said, what artists always talk about, dealers. So will people talk about literary business? Sure, what's going on in Hollywood and that stuff, but very little talk about craft. And except when we're at events, where we're supposed to talk, and I mean like book fairs. And then all of a sudden, two or three of us get on stage and we're deep into these discussions of craft. It's very amusing to me because and we all love it because we don't get to talk about it any other time because Dave will kill us. So, what have I learned? What I have learned, mostly on stage, listening during the book fairs, what I have learned about novelists is they all do it a different way. There is just no set formula. Somebody like Sue Grafton started writing chapter 1 and could not go on to chapter 2 until every word was perfect. That chapter was never going to be rewritten. When she got to whatever the end of the book was, she'd write that last chapter and it was done. Then there are people like Ridley Pearson who outlines obsessively. Greg Iles is more in my mode, but even more so. And he'll literally lock himself in a room and write day and night. It's the only way he can get anything done. And I understand writing with that kind of zeal, but I think it kills you if you're trying to do it day in and day out. So, but that is certainly something I have learned, is that nobody does it the same way. You come out at the other end and they're all books you love to read, but I'm not even sure we've had a conversation, which I think would be interesting, to say, how much do you think about the reader when you're writing? Mm-hmm. And maybe the next time we're together, I'll try to whisper and ask.
Okay.
Richard kind of wants to know which of the novels was the hardest for you to write.
That's a great question. And not one I'm often asked. For whatever reason, my fourth novel, The Laws of Our Fathers, was the hardest for me. I wanted to write a book sort of in the legacy of the hippie novel about the 60s, which were certainly far in the past by the time I got around to doing this in the late 80s and early 90s. And I found that it was very hard to explain the cultural shift that had taken place during the 60s, because we were all living in this new world where notions of equality for women and African Americans were accepted broadly, and where sexual mores had changed. Not that those things had been accomplished. We all know they hadn't been, but that they were aspirations for the society certainly in intellectual circles, well established. So, and it was very hard to explain, what the 1950s and the early 60s were like, when girls were supposed to be virgins. And, it was such a bygone world that it was almost like writing about the 19th century. And I found it very hard to get to the kernel of what I had wanted to get to, which was that for all of the tumult, the violence, the silliness, the self-destruction, that the society in many ways had made enormous progress. And perhaps greater progress than at any time during my lifetime. And that's still my perspective on it, and it's not one that's deeply shared. Well, trying to capture that as a writer, and you can't, I forget, it was like one of Todd Haynes' movies. He was trying to write about, the closeted gay people in the, the early 1960s. And it to me, the movie didn't work, because you would look at it and go, well, of course they're being persecuted. Of course, this is a ridiculous way for a human being to live, not being able to be true to him or herself. And, all he's doing is beating us over the head with what's not only obvious, but accepted. And I felt in trying to write The Laws of Our Fathers, I was up against that kind of obstacle. It's the kind of thing I don't think you can approach directly. So, but it took me a while to finally accept the fact that I was gonna, it was best approached by me, again, through that mystery plot. And ultimately the core of the story is about a young man who stages his own kidnapping so that he can get away from the tentacle grasp of his Holocaust survivor father.
So Sandy Stern has had his last trial. What about Scott? What about Mr. Turow?
Scott has definitely had his last trial. I've known that for several years. I walked out of a courtroom in the Circuit Court of Cook County, one of the criminal division courtrooms, now about 8 years ago, and said to myself, I don't think I need to do this again.
What about lawyering?
I retired from commercial practice in August. So I've been very busy working for the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, helping them get ready for a passel of election litigation. In the case of me and the several other lawyers from Denton's with whom I've been working with, we're concentrating on North Carolina. Some people are working on Maryland. Some people are working on Arizona. So I've given a lot of time to that in the last few weeks. And, we anticipate being very busy on election day.
Adrian's also involved, right?
Adrian's a lawyer. Right now she's working as a poll observer in the state of Wisconsin. So they've got a retinue of lawyers who are, she's working overtly for the Democratic Party. And she's out in polling places since early voting began in Wisconsin, several times a week. So.
Joan, do we have any more questions?
No, we do not. If anybody has
Oh,
any.
we have one more.
Here we go. Catherine wants to know, what is the most difficult thing about writing characters which do not share your gender? And could I, if I could add to that, maybe also characters who don't share your race or religion?
Yeah. Well, I was saying to Rich before we began, I rightly or wrongly have not regarded gender as an impossible divide. And Lord knows, female novelists have been writing about men since the mind of man runneth not to the contrary. So, and doing it very well. So, although men are, you know, we're regarded as less perceptive about the condition of women. I still don't find that to be that. I don't regard it as impossible because, you know, I've been lucky enough to, you know, have a wife I love and a mother I loved and, you know, daughters I love, and, you know, I take their lives into myself. Religion, not hard. You know, Rich and I grew up in West Rogers Park that was called the Golden Ghetto. And I didn't know many people who weren't Jewish when I was 13 and moved to Winnetka. But Lord knows, you know, most of my close friends are not Jewish. And certainly my, you know, oldest and dearest friends from college, for example, we don't even think about religion as anything that divides us. You know, Frank is Catholic and David is Lutheran and now a converted Catholic. You know, Jay is Jewish, Al is Catholic. I mean, we don't think about that. So that's not hard at all. I mean, I think, you know, class, frankly, social class is what binds us. I am struggling. I wouldn't say struggling because I think I'm working it through, but the challenge of the book I am writing now, which is about Sandy Stern's granddaughter, Pinky, is that she is almost 40 years younger than I am. That's a big one. And she's just by her own lights, weird. She's, you know, she's not wired the way the rest of us are. And, you know, and I started out with the perspective that that's got to be very painful to feel yourself, especially as you're moving into adulthood, as somebody who's just not especially able to make yourself pleasing to other human beings. And I found as I began to write that was something that she simply accepted about herself. So, but, you know, getting her vocabulary right, you know, that's a challenge, but I do think I'm getting somewhere, so.
All right. Well, thank you. And Scott, thank you for your time this evening. It's always great hearing you opine on all matters. And just thank you. And hopefully again, we'll see you at the Cliff Dwellers.
Yeah, I hope we can do this live at some point.
Yeah.
Well, you know, Pritzker's shutting us down again. So.
Yeah, and it's not any better in Wisconsin.
I refuse to blame the governor.
No, I don't blame him. I'm just saying that the order has been issued.
It has been, and you know, I hold the view that we're in for a rough winter. So the numbers are rising.
And hopefully everyone has their flu shots.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Scott. Thank you, Joan, for navigating this.
Richard.
And thank you for the audience out there. Really appreciate you zooming in. So thank you all. Okay.
Have a good evening.
Okay, good evening.